Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, while the number of sources of local news and information grows, the number of companies controlling that information declines. Mark Lloyd of the Center for American Progress asks, what's that doing to our democracy? You thought judges control the criminal justice system? Not so, argues Angela J. Davis in her latest book. She chats with Jamie Raskin about the growth of prosecutorial power. Up against a hostile White House and EPA, environmentalists have trained their sights on state capitals. And, says Cindy Schwartz of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, with considerable success. Also, we've got poetry by Rose Solari and Grace Cavalieri, and blues from WAMMIE winner Melanie Mason.
Honey, don't you wanna go? I'm leaving, I ain't coming back no more. Sliding Delta runs right by my door. Sliding Delta, you run right by my door.
On the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. A Zogby International poll last summer found that 3 times more Americans could name 2 of Snow White's dwarfs than could identify 2 members of the Supreme Court. That factoid is highlighted in our guest's recent article, Why the FCC Will Get Media Ownership Wrong Again. Frankly, I found the survey a tad misleading because Grumpy and Bashful are both dwarfs and Supreme Court justices. The thrust of this Why the FCC Will Get It Wrong Again article concerns the campaign by big broadcasters to further deregulate the airwaves and what impact that may have on our capacity for self-government and for diversity in America. The problem, the author maintains, is global and local. Mark Lloyd is currently a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he teaches at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. He was a reporter and producer at NBC and CNN, general counsel to the Benton Foundation, and executive director of the Civil Rights Forum on Communications Policy. By the way, that same Zogby poll found that 73% of Americans could name all 3 Stooges, but just 42% could name the 3 branches of the U.S. government. Welcome, Mark, to the Coffee House.
Thank you. What a state we're in this country. Huh?
What a state we're in. Yeah. Tough question for you.
Yes.
Which was the best 3rd Stooge?
Larry.
You're sticking
I'm
with
sticking with Larry.
All right. Well, the right answer was Curly Joe.
Curly.
FCC is reviewing its every 2 years it goes through a review of ownership of the media in the country. Industry's taking a lot of interest in this review, as are consumer organizations. They're looking at the question of how many outlets a particular media business can own in a particular market, and whether they can own both newspapers and TV stations in the same market. Fundamental question, why is it in a country that prides itself in being a free market society, should government have any say whatsoever in who owns the media?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Part of it is the notion that I think we are now a country that views itself as being proudly free market, when we used to view ourselves as being proudly democratic. And there is a distinction. I mean, there's a focus in this country on markets and consumers and spending, and less of a focus on what are our responsibilities as citizens and what are our responsibilities as self-governors. And part of what we were looking at with the study is, if the FCC is authorized to regulate the broadcast industry and the telecommunications industry, and to do that in a way that really promotes democratic engagement, why are all of the questions that the FCC asks so focused on markets?
Well, let me ask you first about
Sure.
your premise.
Yep.
You're saying that if FCC is concerned about democratic engagement, where does that come from? The notion that they should be concerned about democratic engagement?
Well, the FCC Federal Communications Commission is authorized by Congress to create specific rules out of the larger notions of the law on behalf of the public interest, which means the public good. And largely what it was, and this was back in the 1920s where this regulation started, the concern, the initial concern, frankly, was emergency services and the Titanic and things like that. But after that, the concern really was, how do we make sure that we are promoting local democratic engagement and information that people really need in order to be good citizens, whether they were recent immigrants, whether they were folks who were being educated about how to participate effectively in local governance. Those were the foundations of the Congress back in the 1920s authorizing the FCC to actually regulate broadcasters. Yeah.
Okay. And diversity in the media. FCC already has a formula for that, don't they? And that they follow and have concluded that that the country's doing a fine job in this regard, right?
Well, the FCC established under Michael Powell several years ago something they call the Diversity Index. And part of, we applaud Michael, Colin Powell's son, in doing this, because he was really trying to use social science research in a way that was a little harder than it had been done at the FCC before, to really see if we could find a way to actually measure the diversity in local communities and then create an index to determine whether or not there was sufficient diversity to allow greater media consolidation at the local level. And part of what happened as a result of that was that particular index went to the court, and the court struck it down and said the FCC did not apply it in a way that was rational. And so
this would be the Third Circuit Court.
That's right. And so right now the FCC is trying to figure out what they're going to do about whether or not they're going to have an index at all, whether they're going to actually measure local media diversity, or whether or not they will simply take in papers and testimony and then make some recommendation. Again, my thinking right now is, frankly, not an awful lot is going to happen over the next year or so, because Kevin Martin is very smart politically.
He's the FCC chairman.
Current FCC chairman, now that Michael Powell is gone. I think it's not likely that that Kevin Martin is going to push rules that will either get the broadcasters angry, or get the cable folks angry, or get the telephone folks angry. Now that his patron, President Bush, is clearly not going to be in office over the next couple years, and there are some of us who don't think it's likely we're going to have a Republican president. So we don't expect Kevin to do very much coming up.
Well,
yeah.
You're also the author of this, Local Media Diversity Matters, and the subtitle of this, and this came out in January as well, Measure Media Diversity According to Democratic Values, Not Market Values. If we were measuring diversity by democratic values rather than market values, how would the diversity index be different than it is today?
Well, first and foremost, you would make sure that all of the segments in the community were considered. That you would not simply look at whether or not the simple majority in the community was being served, but you would look to find out whether or not particularly significant populations in that community had information that they needed, perhaps in the languages that they spoke. And I did an awful lot of work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there's a large Portuguese-speaking population in that community. And so if you want to speak effectively to that community, you need to speak effectively in Portuguese. And there are a number of communities in the United States that operate the same way, with Latino population or Asian American populations or other populations. part of the old index never looked at small segments that might constitute as much as 10 or 15% of the population in the local community. And so that was one of the recommendations that we came up with. Another set of recommendation really was just simply try to make sure that you capture all the media in the market, that you're not simply looking at the local television stations or radio stations, but that you're looking at everything that's there and trying to find out whether or not people actually use that media and whether or not, most importantly, there is information about what's going on locally that those folks are actually reading. So we're not interested in media about what's happening with the stars in Hollywood. We're not interested in that media. We are interested in whether or not there's media that forms local democratic discussion.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I think that it's very difficult to come up with an index that attempts to not address the question of content. And there's good reason to avoid that, because you're not attempting to tell people what to think, but giving them the tools to think.
Right.
But if we were to look at local news programming, and if we were to consider that as indicators of information that would be the basis for civic engagement, yet we know that with local news, if it bleeds, it leads, that crime and fires and traffic accidents dominate the newscast. How can you, are you saying that that information is part of the matrix that you're using that would establish that there is diversity of information that's reaching the public?
Well, unfortunately, crime and car crashes are part of the local mix. I mean, I used to produce news, and to a great extent, I think it is important for folks to understand that there are fires going on in local communities, or there are car crashes, or there's crime.
But that presentation of that information, doesn't that, in a sense, undermine civic engagement? Because the picture of the world that it generates is one of chaos, of disorder, of things that are out of control, that individuals are at the mercy of the fates.
Well, it does. There's a very smart professor, Chantal Ingar, who writes about this, and part of what he argues is that to a great extent it is the episodic and disconnected nature of the television newscasts that creates a problem. The preponderance of reporting about crime and car crashes and things like that also present a problem, but the real problem is that there's no connection between the crime and the car crashes and whether or not someone is actually responsible for the crime and the car crashes. All these things seem to be disconnected somehow. And when you have these strange things that we call newscasts, unlike discussion programs, that sort of move from topic to topic to topic without tying things together, going underneath the rationale for the crime, with the rationale for the car crash, which may be bad city planning, maybe there should be a stop sign, maybe something needs to happen there that is worth a public discussion. But there's nothing that follows that up with, well, what needs to be done about that? How many car crashes do we actually have here this year? I mean, how much crime actually occurred in this community that is a response, to some law that we may have passed or failed to pass? And so it's more about the lack of connection between the specific incident that's covered and your role as a citizen in voting for laws or for lawmakers to make sure that something is done about it.
We're about out of time, and so I just wanted to ask you, which do you think is a greater problem for engendering civic engagement and for democracy? The question of diverse voices and people being reflected in the media, or the sense of chaos and disorder that this disconnected picture that the news media paints provides?
Well, I think they're both problems. If there were, if there's one thing that I had to work on, I would focus on diversity. And it is both diversity and equality. And so the challenge is we want to make sure that there are enough Mark Cohens out there, but we also want to make sure that Mark Cohen has as much power in the media marketplace as Don Imus or Rush Limbaugh.
I'm for that.
Right, and so that's another part of the problem. And so it's not simply enough to say, well, we've got 1,000 people out there. You have to say, is there real equality in the diversity that's being presented? And the hope is that if you really have diverse viewpoints presented and diverse people on the air in equal fashions, that they can begin to push a little bit on the episodic nature of the newscast that we put on the air.
Fair enough. Many thanks to Mark Lloyd of the Center for American Progress for joining me in the coffee house to discuss the effects that media concentration have on our civil knowledge and capacity for self-governance. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Great.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Because of their size and the shape of their ears, and the sweetness and wisdom she claimed to see in their miraculously lashed eyes, my mother, for as long as I can remember, loved elephants. At the zoo, she would linger chuckling before their house, the babies in particular seeming to hold some charm for her, their wrinkled legs belying their years. Someone in cruelty had called her an elephant once when she was a girl because of her size, which she could not control, despite a diet of not much more than cigarettes and overperked coffee. Perhaps her fondness for those creatures started then, a way of turning the pain around, as after her death I would tell my friends that it was easier to love my mother now that she'd lost the burden of her body. When she began to collect them, china, brass, and seashell, carved into the tops of wooden or pewter boxes, blown out of glass, it was a relief to all of us, I think, to have something to give this woman who almost no gift could please. Now she had found one small, true thing that could never fail her. Regardless of value, she adored them all, arrayed them across the piano, her dresser, the windowsills, as if like guard dogs they marked the perimeters of her turf. She hardly went out at all by then. The cough that embarrassed her children, rising as it would at all the worst moments, kept her at home. And then the oxygen, of course, those last years of hers attached to a metal tank. Long after the dusting and polishing had become an impossible chore, we still brought them to her like flowers, like a language without anger that we had found at last to speak. The weekend after my mother's funeral, I drove to the beach, thinking I might uncover at the meeting of sand and water better words than the priest who mispronounced her name had used to say goodbye. It was May and raining, though each morning of those 3 days I put on my bathing suit and wore it beneath my clothes, as if desire alone could change the weather. On the last night, with no answers yet to whisper into the emptiness you feel when your best enemy has fallen to infinite silence, I went for one more walk on shore and threw into the waves the last present I'd given my mother, a small silver elephant, its trunk raised up like a greeting, like a promise of something better, not only rest and peace, but please, I prayed some happiness for that woman whose heart, so bruised by time and sorrow, might yet, in another life, be healed by joy.
Hi, welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Recent dramatic events involving the Duke University lacrosse players and the current investigation of Attorney General Gonzalez for his firing of 8 U.S. attorneys have focused public attention on that essential governmental official, the American prosecutor. What's the role of the prosecutor in our criminal justice system? Are prosecutors performing their duties fairly? What recourse does an accused person, or indeed the public, have when they don't? And should the public pay closer attention and demand more accountability from our prosecutors? Is politics the problem here, or is it the solution? I'm Jamie Raskin, Maryland State Senator from Silver Spring and Tacoma Park, and with me to explore these pressing issues is Angela Jordan Davis, a professor of law at American University, former director of the Public Defender Service in D.C., and the author of the new and important book, Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor. Welcome, Angela, to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Jamie.
And I guess we should begin with some full disclosure here. We are colleagues at American Universities, yes. Washington College of Law,
yes.
and friends.
Yes.
But this will not prevent me from being extremely tough on you
Good.
Here in this interview.
Excellent.
So let's start with this. You've got a long distinguished career as a public defender, a criminal defense attorney, one of America's most famous criminal defense attorneys. What gives you the authority, in essence, to dissect the institution of American prosecution?
Well, I spent 12 years of my life as a public defender, and in that experience, it gave me the opportunity to really look at and have firsthand experience with this awesome power that prosecutors have. And I had that experience as a staff attorney in cases of my own and as the director of the office. And it was then that I really became interested in and really shocked, I should say, at this unbridled, unfettered power and discretion that prosecutors exercise in our criminal justice system.
The way that the public thinks about it is that it's pretty simple. There are a set of rules, and then someone violates the rules, allegedly, and the prosecutor gets the evidence from the police and goes and charges it. Isn't it that simple?
Well, that's what prosecutors are supposed to do, and we need prosecutors, absolutely, and I don't purport that we should take power from them or that we should take discretion from them. But the problem is that because there's no transparency in the system and because the mechanisms of accountability that we have for prosecutors don't work, in my view, the prosecutors engage in behavior that oftentimes produces disparities in our system. And that's what I saw as a public defender. Oftentimes I would see cases involving similarly situated individuals who were treated differently in the system by prosecutors. I don't think necessarily intentionally, but defendants with a similar record engaged in the same type of behavior, one would get more favorable treatment than the other. The same with victims. Some victims would be treated better than others. Sometimes those disparities seem to break down along race and class lines, and sometimes, quite frankly, it just seemed that the power and the discretion was being exercised in a way that was arbitrary, which is why I chose that title for the book. And so I thought that was unfair, and I saw that unfairness a lot. I tell a lot of stories in the book about real cases where that unfairness occurred.
One of those stories really jumped out at me when I read your book yesterday. There was a case in Georgetown where there were two roommates, and one essentially sliced the other in half with a machete in a fight about a party.
Right.
And tell us about that, and then compare it to that other case that you juxtaposed it with.
Well, that case, I wrote about that case because that case stood out in my memory. It wasn't a case that I handled, but it was handled by another lawyer in my office. And it was one of the few white clients that our office, ever got. Most of our clients were African American and poor. This was a Georgetown student who was eligible for a public defender. He was charged with homicide. He killed his roommate. And it stood out for me because the prosecutor reached out to my colleague and said, if you want to give me favorable information about your client, maybe the grand jury won't indict him. And in fact, the grand jury did not indict this young man. It was just very unusual because I'd had tons of homicide cases that I dealt with. Oftentimes there was as much evidence as self-defense or other defenses, but I never had a prosecutor reach out to me and say, is there anything about your client that you'd like me to know that is helpful? That never happened for me. And so I couldn't help but think that it was, in fact, the race of or the class of this individual that perhaps resulted in the favorable treatment. At least it appeared that way. And so when I became a law professor, I decided to research it because, people talk about anecdotal stories all the time. And in fact, my research showed that there are racial disparities in the criminal justice system. We know that. And most of the time, we focus on things like racial profiling by police officers, and indeed that is a problem. But very few people pay attention to prosecutors and the decisions that they make every day, namely the charging decisions and plea bargaining decisions that they make behind closed doors that, in my view, produce these disparities.
Now, has the Supreme Court essentially insulated that process? I'm thinking of the case McCleskey versus Kemp with respect to the death penalty.
Yeah, McCleskey versus Kemp, and there are other cases that I think more relevant involve selective prosecution. That is, if The Supreme Court basically says if you can prove that a prosecutor intentionally prosecuted a person because of his race or intentionally refused to prosecute because of race, then you have a remedy. Well, I don't suggest that prosecutors are intentionally discriminating against people. I don't think that happens in this day and age that often, if ever. I don't think so. Most prosecutors, I believe, are well-meaning public servants who are out there doing their job and trying to do it right. I think it's the unconscious decisions that prosecutors make when they're making these charging and plea bargaining decisions, when they treat one person better than another. I don't think they're intentionally thinking about race and class, but I think it's those unconscious views that, quite frankly, all of us have that influence those decisions. And because they have so much power and their decisions really, have sometimes life and death results, when we consider the death penalty, we really, I think, have to pay attention to that and change the way that we're, that our system works.
And the court's
for
not
prosecutors.
interested in the patterns of unconscious bias that
no,
infiltrate
the court
system.
is not. I mean, you're a constitutional law professor,
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not intentional discrimination, they really don't. But, it's not just the disparities, though, Jamie. It's the other thing that I saw a lot was prosecutorial misconduct. And that is when prosecutors engage in behavior that is either unethical or illegal, and the most widespread form of it is the failure of prosecutors to turn over exculpatory information, which is a constitutional requirement. When they know that there's information out there that's helpful to the defense, they are required, in a case called Brady versus Maryland, right here, came from this state, to turn that information over. And there have been studies done by the Center for Public Integrity. Other investigative journalists have done studies that have really demonstrated and documented that this is a pretty widespread problem. I'm not saying it happens every day, but it happens a lot.
Well, the most recent dramatic evidence of this was what took place in North Carolina.
Yes.
To what extent does that surprise you, and what's your analysis of what took place with the Duke lacrosse players?
Well, that case, it was a difficult case, just fraught with all kinds of issues, including an African American victim. And historically, African American rape victims have not been treated well in the system, and so maybe this prosecutor was trying to not treat these white well-to-do defendants differently, and that's fine. But what came out in the case is that he failed to turn over exculpatory information. And I guess what was a little, I want to say hypocritical, I thought, was when the Attorney General of the state came out and said, called Mr. Nivong, a rogue prosecutor, and acted as if this was just a shocking, unusual thing that he didn't turn that over, when there's evidence that Brady violations, which is what that is called, happens every day. And as I mentioned several studies that I discuss in my book, it is, in my view, a fairly widespread problem with prosecutors not turning over that information. So for me, what is troubling is that those violations occur every day. Mm-hmm. And poor people and people of color are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system as both victims and defendants. And they suffer from that kind of prosecutorial misconduct every day. And they don't have the remedy because they don't have a high-powered defense team like those the lacrosse players had, who have the resources to go out and investigate.
They
and
were fortunate to have
it.
the resources
exactly. And I think
uncover
one of
what
them,
was taking
to
place.
his credit, one of the young men acknowledged that. We were able to discover this misconduct because we've got the resources. And he, mentioned to his credit that there are so many people in the criminal justice system who are victims of this kind of misconduct, and it never comes to light. So
right.
Hopefully, this will bring the problem to light, and I want people to know that it's not just, a few bad apples. It happens far more than we'd like to see.
Okay, but you start off by saying we need prosecutors. There are real crimes that are taking place. There are violent crimes. There are corporate crimes, white-collar crimes. But you've focused our attention on the fact that the prosecutor has an enormous amount of discretion.
Yes.
And they can do a very good job and they can do a very poor job. So what are your suggestions for how we go about improving the system, both the transparency and accountability, but also the job that prosecutors do? What kind of people do we want to become prosecutors?
Well, I think the kind of people that are becoming prosecutors are the right kind of people. I don't think that's the problem. I don't have an attack. I'm not, criticizing them. It's the system of accountability that we have. Most prosecutors are state and local. Most state and local prosecutors are elected officials. And in our democracy, we demand accountability from those to whom we grant power. And here we have prosecutors. The electoral process, in my view, doesn't work very well because there's no transparency. Prosecutors run for office, they don't talk about their charging policies and about what they're going to do to make the system fairer and not, and to have fewer racial disparities. They talk about how they're tough on crime, and about, their opponent talks about how they're tougher on crime. So I think we need more transparency in the system. I think we need to enforce the ethical rules that all prosecutors are bound by, and I think more judges should refer prosecutors to those ethical authorities to those disciplinary authorities when they find prosecutorial misconduct, because I think then more prosecutors will be deterred. If they know that something's going to happen if they engage in misconduct, hopefully they will be deterred from doing so in the
what
future.
do you make of the example being set at the federal level by Attorney General Gonzalez sacking 8 of these U.S. attorneys?
I think it's a prime example of how the system isn't working. The federal system is even more removed than state and local. The president appoints the attorney general, the top prosecutor of the country, and each of the U.S. attorneys in each of the 93 districts. They serve at the pleasure of the president. And so now, when there's overwhelming evidence of either incompetence, or misconduct on the part of the chief prosecutor, there's nothing that we, the people, can do except, hope that the president will remove him, and he's already said he won't. So,
but in this case, weren't there allegations these U.S. attorneys were being removed because they were not sufficiently diligent in going after political opponents of the Republican Party?
Exactly, and the problem is that in our current system, there's nothing that we, the people, can do about it except hope that our president, will remove the person who was responsible for doing it. And he's already indicated he's not going to do that. And to me, what kind of a system is that? We're stuck for the next 2 years. If we vote him out of office, well, he can't run again anyway. So I just think that the whole system, the way the system is designed, is one of these, trust me because I'm the prosecutor. And, we don't do that in a democracy, right? We demand more accountability. And I think that we need to do that for prosecutors especially because they have more power than any other official in the criminal justice.
We're going to have to wrap it up in 1 second. But what's the reaction been to your book from prosecutors themselves? Do they feel really threatened and vilified by this?
Well,
or do they
we'll
like
see. The book just came out. I suspect they're not going to be happy with this book.
Yeah.
But
I bet you John McCarthy, our local state's attorney, will be happy about it.
Actually,
he's a very decent, thoughtful guy.
And Andy Sonner, who was in office before, I've gotten positive feedback from him as well. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been a
Jamie.
very interesting conversation. Many thanks to Arbitrary Justice author Angela Jordan Davis for joining me in the coffee house and for your timely reminder that when justice is arbitrary, justice isn't done. I'm Jamie Raskin, and this has been Writer's Block.
How to make it up to her. She was no stronger than the wheat her father carried to the altar in Sicily for his penance. She was that frail, like the pale yellow Italian sun, others becoming animals as they grew, but she turning into the sky and the ocean until there was finally no place else she could go. I would make her broth if the dead could drink. Bring it in a tin cup. I would take the stories out of the vial of breath I've saved in case my own breath should stop. I'd give it to her, if it would help, but this is of no use to her now. I have so little to give up, except maybe fear which exists only for itself. Out of the crescent moon, from these shapes, I hear my father's voice calling me again last night, low and filled with a holding heart I'd never heard before. Come to yourself, he said. In all her needs and through meanings of her crying, the only thing left is my father's voice, stronger than memory. That was always my trouble in trying to save her, his voice. Now I remember her grief, how she stood by my father's chair as he stared out the window. There she is, so slim. She wears a long, silken dress. Her hands are like first speech. This is progress, I think, her sitting still for it without falling apart, he finally speaking to me. The dead are just as involved as anyone else if you listen closely. They are here to work it out with the living.
Welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House. Global warming has suddenly become a big topic of discussion, but every newspaper article that describes the horrors of hurricanes and rising seas drowning Manhattan, there's another that suggests that just a little tinkering around the house will save the climate. Just change a few light bulbs, that's all we need. But is that really enough to prevent a climate meltdown? Meanwhile, fossil fuels are still skyrocketing in their use, and leading scientists say we have only 10 years to turn this thing around. So who's holding the politicians' feet to the planetary fire? Well, that's why the League of Conservation Voters exists. While other environmental groups promote important policies in education, the League actually keeps a scorekeeper's eye on the politicians and the environmental legislation they either support or oppose. Here to discuss global warming and the newly heightened political activity around this issue is Cindy Schwartz, the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Cindy, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, so the League of Conservation Voters is an environmental scorekeeper with the politicians. What does that mean exactly?
Well, we're actually a little bit more than a scorekeeper. We actually call ourselves the political voice for the environmental community here in Maryland. And actually, there are 38 state leagues around the country, so really speaking for the whole nation in many cases. But what it means is that we work to get good, strong environmental legislation passed by lobbying, but then we look at those votes, we score them, and we rate our legislators on their performance on those bills. We give them a score. We've been doing this for, at least in Maryland, for almost 30 years, and so we have lifetime scores going back years and years and years for some of these folks, and we can watch and see how they are, how they're progressing, and whether or not they're doing good by the environment or not so good by the environment.
So a lot of other environmental groups and political organizations turn to you to get a heads up on how well a politician is or is not doing with basically a report card.
Right. We issue a scorecard every year now. We used to do it every 2 years, but now we've just started to do it every year. We also do reports on the governors. So we just issued our 100 days report on Governor O'Malley here in Maryland. And in 2 years, we will issue a report on his performance and his administration's performance for those 2 years.
Well, let's talk about climate change. There's certainly a lot of attention being paid in the media. You can't pick up a newspaper or turn on the TV without seeing something about global warming. A lot of people are talking about it. It's out there. Are you at the League of Conservation Voters seeing a similar increase in political attention? Are politicians suddenly more and more paying attention to this issue?
Yeah, and in fact, they're paying more attention at the state level and the federal level, and not just in Maryland, but all over the country. It's actually a very interesting sort of political phenomena. I've been doing these kind of issues for many, many years, and I have never seen politicians paying this much attention to an environmental issue.
Now, I know you've done clean water organizing, landmine issues, and you've said that in terms of climate change, global warming, you've never seen the stars align quite like this before in all your 2 decades of experience. What do you mean by that?
Well, for the first time, at least in my lifetime of watching the climate change issue sort of come to the fold, it's the first time that I have at least seen, and I think this bears out in many places around the country, nationally and at state level, but I've never seen, an international issue take hold of people's sort of their psyche. It's like it's ingrained in people. People are talking about it on the street corners. You're seeing it on the History Channel. You're seeing it everywhere. They're talking about global warming and climate change. We're seeing legislators. One of a mutual friend of ours, the Majority Leader Kumar Barve, in Maryland. He said to me, and I believe he said it to you as well, but he said that he saw the Al Gore movie, Inconvenient Truth, and it changed him, and he wanted to do something.
Changed his life.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible thing to have a legislator say that, but I'm personally seeing it like in my son's school. I have a 9-year-old. Mm-hmm. My son's school, they're talking about it. They're talking about it in coffee shops. They're talking about it at state legislatures. They're talking about it at the federal legislature.
So one issue that's being talked about everywhere at one time, from the state level, in schools, national level, media, you've never seen an issue like that, on any social or environmental issue quite like that?
No, well, certainly we've seen, great groups of people come. Civil rights is a perfect example, a public outcry. But to have the convergence of the federal government, state governments, and the public, and then people actually taking extraordinary measures even in their homes to change their light bulbs, to put fluorescent bulbs, and simple things like that. All of these actions come together, and they're building an incredible movement.
So why is this happening now?
I think two reasons. I think one is because Al Gore has been spreading the word through his movie and through his actions. And I think Katrina. I think Hurricane Katrina it made people wake up. Like all of a sudden, the notion of severe weather and climate change and how those two pieces fit together and the consequences of that, it made people wake up. And in a place like Maryland, where we are so vulnerable to that, I mean, Hurricane Isabel was a huge wake-up to the people on the Eastern Shore. 3,100 miles of shoreline in Maryland alone. I mean, a huge amount of the population in this state lives in the Chesapeake Bay watershed.
Well, let's talk about Maryland some more in a second. But, you know, my friend Bill McKibben, the writer, when I asked him the same question, how did the zeitgeist finally change on climate change in America? He said what you said. Katrina opened the door and Al Gore walked through it.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And here we are. And also the Dems have taken over Capitol Hill, so there's more discussion in Washington. And it's just, it's an issue that seems to have arrived. But you take a small state like Maryland, okay? It's a small state, extremely vulnerable to global warming, as you mentioned, 3,100 miles of tidal shoreline. So a foot of sea level rise means we get that in 3,100 miles in Maryland. Hurricanes are getting bigger. But what can one state do? I mean, I know there's increasing action on the state level in terms of climate legislation, clean cars, clean smokestacks, et cetera. But what could one small eastern state do to stop global warming?
Well, for one, I personally believe that a multitude of small actions equal great deeds. And so, one, we organize. And my organization is out there talking to people, and we are empowering them to come together to make change, right? So that's part of what we do. But Maryland in itself, Maryland can be a shining example. Maryland is a very environmentally sensitive state. The water and the mountains and the way that we live and the quality of life that we have in Maryland is very close to people in this state. We need to capitalize on that. We need to harness that, and we need to get them to not only push our state legislators to do stuff, but we can be a huge push on the federal government. And if we can get the federal government to take action, that will be a huge, huge message to the rest of the world.
I know a lot of climate activists all over the country look to California. They see a Democratic General Assembly, a Republican governor, the governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, passing an amazing global warming bill that calls for 25% reductions in greenhouse gases by 2020. Now there's talk of passing a similar bill in Maryland, bringing the Schwarzenegger bill to Maryland. Is that going to happen?
I actually think it is going to happen. One of the things that happened in this last legislative session was that we, for the third year running, tried to get the Clean Cars Act passed. This is to reduce car emissions in the state of Maryland. We all walked into that thinking it was going to be a really big fight. Well, it turns out that Governor O'Malley came in, testified on this bill. We had all of these changes. Kumar Bharvi was coming to us and saying, I want to do something about it. All of a sudden, the tenor in the legislature has changed. So, yeah, and because Clean Cars got passed so quickly, we were actually able to raise that as an issue. We actually talked about it. We lobbied on it. We did a tremendous amount of work on the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I actually believe that that we even will walk into the next legislative session with even more emphasis to get this passed.
So the little eastern state of Maryland, which you know a lot of people point to as the state that surrounds Washington D.C. on three sides. So
not a bad place to be.
That's right. The victories in Maryland are played out on the front page of the nation's newspaper, the Washington Post. And the Clean Cars Bill in Maryland, which has Maryland adopting California's cleaner tailpipe emissions, including reducing CO2, was on the front page of the Washington Post. So now this next step, passing a Schwarzenegger-type bill on global warming in Maryland, might happen next year. Well, talk to us a little bit about on the national level. What is the League of Conservation Voters doing in terms of climate change nationally?
The National LCV is doing a really interesting campaign called The Heat Is On. And what they are doing is because we work on campaigns, that's one of the other sort of the three things we do. We do hardcore campaigning to get environmentalists elected. at the national level, they're focusing a huge effort on the presidential primaries. And so they are going to places like New Hampshire and South Carolina and Iowa, and they are using grassroots strategies of getting folks organized to push the global warming in the debate that is happening. So they're trying to raise the level of the debate around global warming so that when these people who have enormous the ability to talk to the public, I mean, you know, candidates are out there talking to people in their living rooms in New Hampshire, right? Very local politics in, you know, there. But in other places, they're on television. We need to make this an issue in the presidential politics.
And do you think it will be a major issue in the 2007 race in the fall?
I do. It's a huge issue. When you have an issue that is of global magnitude being talked about in coffee shops and on street corners and on regular television, and you know, everybody sort of is in the same place and saying, what are we going to do about this? The presidential candidates are going to have to speak about it.
And you know, it doesn't seem like George Bush is going to do anything meaningful on climate change, but it does look like that whoever's elected on the Republican or Democratic side will almost certainly have a whole new agenda on climate change. Do you think even the Republican candidates will be looking at some kind of change in terms of America's energy policy?
I do. I don't think they have a choice. This, as I said, this is one of those issues that it is gaining incredible momentum. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of folks who are saying if we don't get this under control in 10 years, we will be facing enormous problems. And that affects everybody. You know, this is not an issue that is about party. This issue transcends party politics. It is about the future of the world. And really, not to sound overly dramatic, but it is.
You can't be overly dramatic when it comes to climate change.
It's such an incredible issue.
Yeah, it is.
And it's a big problem. And I think that they'll have to talk about it. And I actually think that this is the great opportunity with that election. Because as I was saying earlier, the stars are sort of aligning. There's one piece that we're missing right now, and that is having the president of the United States of America standing up saying we need to do this in a meaningful way.
Well, let's hope that happens. Well, a big thanks to Cindy Schwartz of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters for describing the state of politics in this country around global warming. Can a small eastern state like Maryland, disproportionately vulnerable to climate change, actually set a clean energy example for the rest of the nation? Well, perhaps with the right political leadership and a good scorekeeper for good measure. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
You better come on in my kitchen. It's going to be raining outdoors. The man I love stole from my best friend. That gal got lucky, stole him back again. You better come on in my kitchen. It's going to be rain outdoors. Oh no, he's gone. He won't be back. He took the last nickel out of my nation sack. You better come on in my kitchen. It's going to be rain outdoors. Woke up man this morning, Blues was walking like a man. Woke up man this morning, blues was walking like a man. Said good morning blues, baby give me your right hand. Well, the blues grabbed mama's child, tore me all inside out. The blues grabbed mama's child, tore me all inside out. Traveling up the road, babe, man, you can't be turned around. Ride, Papa, ride, ride all these blues away. Gonna ride, Papa, ride, ride all these blues away. Gonna ride on to the sunset, gonna stay out all day.
Well, that was wonderful. Welcome,
you.
Melanie, to the musical tradition segment of the show.
Hey, David.
Welcome. Let's go right into a little bit of history about this CD. Let's see, it came out about when?
January 2001.
Okay. And I think on the strength of this CD, you have won in the Washington area what's known as a WAMMIE Award.
That's right, a Washington Area Music Association Award for Best Blues Recording.
Okay. Now, I've heard you a number of times, and each time it's your more acoustic self.
Right.
But in fact, this album is a bigger band.
It's more what I call an electric album. We have one acoustic tune on there by Mississippi John Hurt, but besides that, most of the material is original, and I play lead electric guitar, and Mickey Michael John, our harp players, on it, and a lot of good people in the area are on it too.
Cool. Very
Yeah.
good. How'd you get started in this genre?
I heard the Beatles come together when I was 12 and just fell in love with that kind of blues-influenced sound, and then followed the path of their influences to see who they listened to, who the Stones listened to, and pretty soon I was listening to people like Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson.
Going back to the roots.
Exactly, tracing the roots.
Okay. The two songs that you had, that you opened with, what were they? It was a little medley.
That was a medley of Robert Johnson tunes, Come On In My Kitchen and
Right.
Preachin Blues.
Okay. And what are you going to take us out with?
Well, the one from our album, Mississippi John Hurt's Sliding Delta.
Okay. And I should mention that they can also find this on your website.
That's right.
We're sounding like an infomercial, but hey, it's our show, you know? MelanieMason.com.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Take us home.
Thanks a lot.
Sliding Delta runs right by my door. Sliding Delta, you run right by my door. Sliding Delta runs right by my door. Sliding Delta, you run right by my door. I'm leaving here, sweet baby, honey, don't you wanna go? I'm leaving, I ain't coming back no more. Sliding Delta runs right by my door. Sliding Delta, you run right by my door. My suitcase is packed, my trunk's already gone. Tell me, what in the world you waiting on? by my door. To the river this morning, sat down on the ground, had a notion to jump on in and drown.